day, my fellow Americans and good people of the world. Today I would like to address you in regards to the economy. To me, economy means liberty. And what I'm hoping to bring about in this particular conversation is the idea that we could intentionally use the mechanizations of our economy to achieve the opportunities that will provide liberation for more and more people, achieving what I believe is the original spirit of intent of our nation, America. It's like our motto, this unspoken understanding between us. And that's the concept of go forth and freedom go with you. And our job is to be the living embodiment of that, the living answer of how do we go forth so freedom goes with us, and extend that living answer to as many people as possible. And that's really what liberty is able to accomplish. It's that living answer. And as far as I see it, I really believe that economy, in order for it to achieve this objective of standing for liberty, and for liberty to be about going forth and freedom going with us, and to extend that freedom to as many people as possible, it has to achieve the ultimate goal of having some proper intended use. And I very much believe in capitalism as one of the ideal models for economics. But unfortunately, the misuse of anything, or the lack of proper use, well defined and distinguished and delineated, leaves room for something to be just pulled here and there. And this is what they call the free market society. But when we look at it, things really aren't free. It's a very limited system that is pay to play, and it's rigged out of the favor of a significant amount of people so that they don't have the means to pay or play. And so it's not really free. It's free in a sense of the government isn't directing specifically where things go and the limits where things can go, and has full stake in a company, and essentially the company operates as an extension of the government. But when you look at like the way things are being modeled right now in economics, increasingly the private sector has been merged with the public sector, in terms of the state and the economy are operating together as if they are one instead of separate. So it's almost like we have a communism, except for it's not common to everybody else. It's just the higher echelons of society, those who have amassed, great money, wealth, power, and influence, that are able to operate in this system and essentially tell each other what to do. And they feed off of each other, and they reinforce one another in this like high-powered state that is run by essentially oligarchs, and then this high-powered economy that's essentially run by oligarchs. And there's not any like actual maneuverabilities within the system at the lower levels. I mean, you can kind of like move a couple grains of rice over here and a couple grains of rice over here, but you're never going to be able to accumulate enough to amass a large stockpile of the resource. So the issue with that, of course, is dysfunction. It very much is well defined, what this looks like, what it's about, how this is rigged for fatal synergies, and will eventually lead to the collapse of the state. We're already seeing that in many ways, where there's, things are falling apart because they lack any sort of integrity. It's all just a matter of like expedient fixes and what can we do to make it appear like things are working and functional. when in reality it's more like we're going to break something and then, say that we fixed it, and then everybody's happy that, the broken thing was fixed, even though the broken thing was created so that they could just say they fixed something, but in reality everything is, didn't improve anything prior to that break. But going forward, things are actually progressively getting worse. And so it's more of a distraction than it is, a development of something that can resolve for these issues, because the status quo, as the word's commonly used, is like things that have just been, and that's the way things are, and the way things are going to continue to be unless something changes. The status quo is directed in terms of the state being intertwined and deeply intertwined and dependent upon the higher echelons within the capitalistic system, and these people are in the higher echelons of the economic system, in the massive wealth, require the state to work with it so that it can retain as much value as possible, extract more, because in that system there is never enough. They always need more. It's like, greed and gorge, and it's never fulfilling. There's no way to be satisfied in that regard. And they know the game, so they can't really extract from each other unless they rig arbitrary schemes, and then they make it into kind of like a gamification, kind of like Bitcoin does. Then people will play and participate. Stock market, gambling, and Bitcoin, these sorts of things are all gamifications of the system where they can play with each other. Same thing happens with like art deals, selling art and things like that. Some people even do it in the realms of philanthropy, where it's not necessarily they're doing it out of the kindness of their hearts, but more of the fact that it's playing with the tax deductions that they can get, or their way to shelter money from being taxed. And it's this whole rigged system. And in order for them to operate the way that they do, they need to have as little oversight, as little regulation, and as little consequences as possible. They try to make sure that the consequences is only like monetarily based, and that the fines are really low because they just write it out in their bottom line. And at the end of the year, because of all of the tax rigs within the system, they end up paying zero tax anyway. So it's basically free range to spend the money however they want, wherever they want, whenever they want, as long as, these rigs in the system make it so that as long as you play in these different areas in this certain way, at the end of the year, you're not really paying for anything to functionally operate. The cost of the operation and the administration and the development and the sustainment of the governing systems that keep everything flowing and going is brought on to the middle class and then the lower classes, and where their labor wages are taxed. And because there's enough of them, and the rates are high enough, that tax system is enough to kind of keep the lights on, so to speak. Excuse me. But again, it's operating off a system where it's never going to be enough. And even though they can, write out losses in their bottom line, end up paying zero tax at the end of the year, shelter their money in offshore accounts, or hide it in, LLCs, or, hide it in nonprofits, where they don't actually spend that money for nonprofits. They just kind of like sit there and let it bank, and then at least it's not taxed. And then they pass it out maybe every once in a while. There's plenty of people that, break the rules, bend the rules, and the enforcement, in order to keep people in check and make sure everybody's playing fairly, playing by the rules, there are less and less enforcement, the more and more entangled that these upper echelons of the wealthy embed themselves in the government, lobby in the government, implant their people in the government, or have people that are in the government promised a sweet, comfy, cozy, very high-paying position once they get out, and they've served their purpose in government to get the laws and rules passed to make enough, free space for these people to play their little games with money and finance, but, leaves everybody else flipping the bill. And so the system, obviously being as rigged as it is dysfunctional. And it's not that I think anybody suffering financial hardship is funny, because it's not. But I do find it quite humorous that the people in the upper echelons of society are realizing that they can't eat themselves. And there's less and less substance from which them to feed off of in the lower echelons of society, because the system's been far too rigged for far too long out of the favor of the many for the sake of the few. And so you see a lot of, worry and concern about people in the upper echelon. And there's actually people that are making a significant amount of money, but because of the way that things, again, are rigged for a concentrated, very limited few, these little isolated pockets of thriving, there are many people who used to benefit from these rigged systems that have fallen below a certain threshold, and now they're in the fringe, and now they are suffering what other people in the lower realms have had to suffer for longer. And so we're seeing more people shrink, the, top 1%, shrinking to even smaller portions. More people falling into the lower, mid-level echelons of society. And then more people going into poverty. So yeah, we're growing the middle class, but because the people in the upper class are actually getting taken down a notch, But then when you calculate how many people are falling out of the middle class and going into, the modest or meager means levels of the echelons of society, the lower echelons of society, you begin to see why the system is not sustainable. Because the robustness of the middle class was really what was able to sustain the system, and we tried as a society to say, we're not going to let people fall too low, so we're going to create these social safety nets to make sure that, people are not completely destitute, because we shouldn't live in a nation like that. So we created these social safety nets to try to, hold people's head barely above water, and help them in that regard. But more and more people in the upper echelons were like, I don't think more of my pay should go towards, funding this. I want to keep more of my money. And so the tax burden for sustaining these systems fell completely to the middle class. And so it just ate up the substance of what they had to build tangible wealth with and to build generational wealth with, and they fell down into lower brackets, which means that there's actually less tax base to be able to fund these social systems. And instead of being like, oh, well, that means that we need to, make adjustments in terms of what type of revenues we're taking in, increase them so that we can maintain this, standard of living for people, considering inflation happens, cost of everything goes up, wages don't really increase, in comparison to the cost of cost of living. So we need to take a little bit more from the upper echelon to be able to sustain the lower echelon. And instead, which is very much Republicans, side of things in terms of how they look at it, it's like, let's just, give tax breaks to the rich, and then we'll cut the funding for these lower echelon survival mechanisms that we've created over time. It create the extreme limitations. It's already a demoralizing, limited system in terms of getting support. They're trying to make it even harder to, qualify for it. And they don't care because they don't understand there's this gap that, the wealth inequality gap between the, extreme wealth and then the middle class is huge. It's a chasm, and it's painful, and it's hard, and it's difficult because so many people think that they're being priced out of a good life, and they are. But you need to look at the gap between the modest means and the meager means. And then like total destitution. Like total destitution and meager means are basically, I mean, from one day to the next, you could be in either one of those realms. And you're just one unexpected accident or oops or, you know, unforeseeable circumstance or, you know, economic shit hit the fan, excuse my language, but something completely beyond your control and you go from meager means into destitution. That is a difficult, I mean, you're constantly having to spend so much time just keeping in survival mode in that regard, and so much wasted human ingenuity and potential in that regard of just struggle, struggle, struggle. But then there's this huge chasm in between even that and the meager means, not in terms of like they're so far apart from each other, but this chasm in terms of how to get yourself out of the destitution and the meager means into modest means, which is still below the poverty line. I mean, you're basically living in poverty, but you're a working class individual who has to get social supports, and you still can't make ends meet, and you have to rob Peter to pay Paul, and you have accumulated a massive amount of debt because you have to go in debt in order to just functionally work in society. And so you're not really well off, you're not stable, you're not balanced, and your life is not sustained, you're not living the good life, but you are not, you know, to the point where you're destitute and you're living on the street. And the chasm between those two is really difficult to bridge, because of the fact that the social safety nets are designed by legislators who have never had that experience. They have no sensibilities of it all at all. They have no sympathies. They have no compassion for it. You know, they may have empathy, like, oh, you know, I understand. Sure, you can put yourself in somebody else's shoes and be like, I feel that must be terrible, you know, but they don't have the desire to act to change that. And so they lack compassion, because empathy plus the desire to act is your compassion. And so where these policymakers have the capacity to enact policies, to create some, you know, game-changing event, create change makers, empower change makers that can, you know, infiltrate these communities to the point where they can uplift people by giving them agency, resource, and capital, and working with them most directly. So, and then be able to pass along, you know, the sensibilities to everybody else, so policymakers can feel, you know, I accomplished something, you know, bring those data sets to them so that they can say, all right, it was worth it, you know, so they can justify their policy making and then be able to argue the point to everybody else, you know, give them the sensibilities of like, this is why we must care, you know, this, we have the empathy because we don't need people in that position because it's terrible. You know, this is America, we're better than that. But also here are the tangibilities in terms of like how we accomplish to make that, you know, a consistency, and not in the sense of where I think, you know, Republicans have it right, in the sense we can't just constantly feed into these systems. We have to create resolutions to them, solve for them. But the problem is most of those solutions come from changing the status quo systems that have been rigged in favor for far too long for the, you know, upper elite echelons of society. And they're not about ready to do that, because first of all, they are going to be bearing the blunt of that blow first, you know, and it's going to take much longer for the more powerful people to fill it. And these people, in the desperation of wanting to maintain their status quo, are going to abandon everybody else in order to save themselves, you know, and convince, you know, the upper echelon, well, you need to give us a little bit more so that we can keep things the same for you. And so they buffer each other. But again, this chasm between, you know, destitution and meager means, to get to the point where you have modest means, is difficult, because you have these, you know, qualifications for social safety nets that say, if you make over this amount of money, you no longer qualify for food stamps, or you no longer qualify for child care supports, or you no longer qualify for TANF, or you no longer qualify for energy assistance, or you no longer qualify for, you know, HUD vouchers for your house. You no longer qualify for all of these things because you have now just gotten over. I mean, even if you're a dollar over it, you're disqualified. And now that means even though your paycheck, you may have gotten like $1 raise, woohoo! I mean, it's great, it's good, raises are awesome. But your $1 raise now just bumped you up to the higher bracket, so you no longer qualify for those social supports. But that dollar does not make up for the childcare, the HUD vouchers, the food stamps, all of these things. And so you were actually worse off, and then you will not be able to maintain and sustain that, and you will lose your job and you will fall back down. You will lose your job before you are able to level up to get another raise, where you can get to the actual income level where you can yourself afford, through self-reliance and fair compensation for your work and your contributions, to be able to pay for all that stuff yourself without the social safety net. But you fall into that area where you no longer qualify, but actual doing it on your own doesn't apply to you and probably won't for a very long time. So there's this whole chasm of falling in and out, and going back and forth, and it's a self-reinforcing impoverishment. It is a rigged system. This is policy enacted and policy initiated because of the terms and conditions and the rules and regulations that have been embedded within the policy that says this is what we are using as a determination. And so that chasm is the one where we need to create new re-envisioning for our policies in order to make sure that the help that we're giving is actually accomplishing what we want to do. And then again, creating the appropriate data points to prove like this system really does work, so that the policy makers can be like, okay, it's worth it for us to do this. And then you need to tie it into the other end. We need to show, people in the upper elite echelons of society that it's worth it. It is worth it to make an investment in the raising of the standard to a criterion standard of living in America. And I'm going to tell you a lot of reasons why, but first I want to say this is the reason why we need to make this story of how to, make sure that America works for 100% of the people here without the disadvantage of anyone, so that nobody gets left behind and nobody gets kept behind and everybody lives the good life. Why that narrative, that story of us is truly, truly important. And why I don't believe the way to get there is based in a narrative of eat the rich, tax the rich, pay your fair share, and fight the oligarchy. And I know that that's a really difficult narrative to break down, and people have stood behind that because it gives them a sense of empowerment. It's the many against the few, and we got to stand up, and this isn't fair, and we're trying to make it fair. And they are enraged that the system has been rigged out of their favor for so long, and they're trying to put that infectious rebellion into something. And it is a force that seems like, if we all just work together, we can fight these guys. And my thing about it is that you're not going to get the effect that you want by consistently trying to fight the old system. It's a Buckminster Fuller quote. You don't change the system by fighting it. You just make it obsolete by creating a system that's newer and that's better. And so, how do we make a better system? Well, we're going to need to work together. We're going to need the people from the upper echelons of society to accept the system as it is unsustainable. Things are going to fall apart because there is no integrity in the system. And that will eventually catch up to you in a very harsh, very painful way. And you may have insulated yourself in a pocket of thriving for long enough, and you've accumulated assets, and you got a sense of comfortability. You've built your bunkers, right? And you have your compounds, and you've planned out the people you're going to get as your bodyguards when shit hits the fan, and excuse my language, but and the whole world goes down, and you'll be behind these gated communities with massive walls, and you'll be safe. Okay, that's what you've chosen to put your money into. Investing in self-preservation, when the best way to secure your own self is by making sure everybody else around you is living to a standard of good life, that they have no reason to come after you with pitchforks and torches. The idea of having this sense you have to hunker down is really them resigning to the end. It's them seeing no hope in the system. Hey, the system can't be fixed. It's all just gonna go to hell eventually, and we're gonna be protected when the day comes. And I get it. I get the sensibility behind that, because people of all walks of life do that. They try to insulate themselves with some sort of protection against the outside world, when they know that they can't control everything that's going out there. They can do their part to try to affect change, but it takes a collective cultural shift of the whole of humanity to align and in tune with the sensibilities that we need to work together to create an ever more healthy, sustainable, just, and peaceful world in order for things to get better. And with the infighting and the factioning and the creating of rifts in between everybody, and everybody, picking and choosing sides and pointing fingers and casting blame, and, fighting against the oligarchs, and, fighting against the, poor people who, are getting fed up, and they're raising up and, protest or whatever. And it's like, we got to squash dissent before it gets out of hand, and pushing people to their limits and pushing people into corners. And then when they get in that desperation mode, they lash out, and you can't anticipate what they're going to do. It's just a terrible situation, but it doesn't have to be that way, and it shouldn't be that way. And argue that it doesn't have to be that way in a sense of we can do something about it that isn't about hunkering down. I think it's more about reinforcing the sensibilities that we're self-sufficient, self-sustaining, free and independent people, self-reliance, and we're self-governed, is really important to enforce and reinforce, not just in the sense of like we need to create laws and policies that give us that safe space, that insulary protection that we really do want, crave, and need, but also for a sense of like it's bringing it into the narrative. This is our American identity. This is what we stand for. And so, people from all walks of life they want to protect themselves. They want to protect their children. They want to protect their families. They don't want to fear what may happen if, things get out of control and law becomes lawless. And instead of like being feared into, questioning, can your neighbor be trusted? Or, profiling certain people that have been made out to, assumably be bad actors with nefarious intent, or, bad hombres or whatever, profiled based off of their race or their age or their sex or their gender or their gender identification or whatever, categorical, reference that you want to make. Those sorts of things are doing nothing but it's making us live in a state of fear, perpetual fear, and that cuts off your brain from thinking. It literally detaches an individual away from their problem-solving skills, and it cuts them off from their creativity, and keeps them in a perpetual state of worry and concern, fear, doubt, uncertainties. And those are the sorts of things that bad actors with nefarious intent play on, those notions of fear. and use it to suppress people and exploit people and cause harm to people. And so it's not to say that, everybody is a bad guy, a bad actor with nefarious intent. But we're made to believe that there's more bad actors with nefarious intent out there than there actually are. And so we look at everybody suspiciously. And we become critical, and we become cynical, and we become, suspicious of each other, suspicious of our neighbors, suspicious of our friends and family, suspicious of our government, and then we get suspicious of classifications and categorizations, race, class, creed, economic standing, and they become these things that we wedge in between each other, and they split us farther apart. And that destabilization is, you can follow that. It's a through line. You can follow that back to so many of the root issues that we have with civilization and why civilizations fall, And it's way too much of an accumulation of concentrated money and power and wealth and influence into a few people who create insulated pockets of thriving, and they cut themselves off from having connection to the common human touch, and because of that they lose sight of what other people are experiencing. They don't understand that there are consequences to their actions and their decisions, and they don't care about the outcome consequences unless they directly affect themselves. And they move themselves so close into this insulated pocket of thriving, they forget that there are actually outcome consequences that other people experience that over time will compound and will eventually come to bear on the total situation and actually make things more destabilized for those who have created these insulary pockets of thriving. So when you think of that idea that we have to create, a thriving, stable, safe situation that everybody can thrive on, and that's the best circumstance for us to operate in order to make sure that things work well for everyone, then we're taking the situation out of, this isn't about, the people who have the most accumulated money versus the people who have absolutely nothing. It is between the haves and the have-nots, but it's more in a sense of you have the capacity and the capability to provide great care in such a way that will make a substantial and significant difference in the lives of the many, doing things that would not take much away from you. I understand the argument of not wanting to pay taxes into something that you don't see a return on investment with. I totally get that. But again, living in your little bubble, your little insulated pocket of thriving, you don't remember the fact that if the person who delivers your groceries so you didn't have to go to the store, or the chef that has those groceries brought in to cook for you at your house, your private chef, if there were no roads and there were no gas stations and there were no, clerks at the store, and if there were no stockers to stock the shelves, if there were none of these things that keep society functioning and operating, your desire to have these, groceries delivered to your house to be cooked by your private chef would never make it through the chain of transaction in order to get to you, if not for all of the other infrastructures that we've built up together over time, that we've used public funds to be able to build and establish, to reinforce, to maintain, to build and rebuild. There's a lot of things that are wholly dependent on that one thing that you desire. And so you lose the sense of being grateful for what you have, because you are not connected directly to what you have, what it took for you to have what you end up having, what it took to get it there. You lose that appreciation, and you lose the appreciation for like all of the strings pulled and levers pulled and buttons pushed and pages turned and things lifted and things dropped and all of the functions of society that make shit happen. Again, excuse my language. Those things, you're so many degrees far removed from them, like you don't think and you don't care. And that is the convenience effect. And everybody at some degree of life experience that convenience effect. To some people, it means that they don't have to worry about, you're a brand new parent and you got a precious little baby and, you're exhausted because, new baby in your life, baby wakes up in the middle of the night, needs to be fed, needs to be changed, all of these things, plus you have your regular life that still has to go on, work and maintaining a house, but now you have all these extra responsibilities, and now you just don't have the time to go to the store, and now you have to buy more supplies than you did before, diapers and wipes and formula, and bottles and like all of this stuff that you now all of a sudden need that you didn't need before. First of all, very expensive. It is not cheap to have kids, which is a big reason why we have a declining demographic, a declining population. But so when you have this new thing that you have to, involve yourself with, the sensibilities of being a parent and all of this stuff that comes with it, there is a huge amount of convenience that you are taking advantage of, that everybody has the opportunity to take advantage of if they have the right, capacities, levers to pull. They have the right capital, agency, and resource. You can participate and contribute in society, in the economy, in such a way where you can capitalize on convenience. And that convenience could be that you could call somebody to come and deliver you those diapers so you don't have to go to the store. Man, that saves you time, money, effort, energy, gas to go there, and you don't have to take a crying baby into the store and then be around a bunch of strangers that who knows, in the wintertime, whether or not they got the COVID or whatever, and just convenience. And it's a great thing. And, to you, it's simple as you pay a little bit of money for this convenience fee and this thing happens for you. But the working gears of all of it takes to make that happen is the mutual advantages that we all get to take based off of the things we've created together before that have made that possible. And people at every level of society has those types of benefits. Bus systems for people to be able to ride on, the lamp post that keeps the street lit at night so that you can see where you're going, the lights that keep traffic flowing in a safe way, and the stores that stock your goods, the people that clean up the leaves on the street come fall, the people that clean up the snow in your street and plow it in the wintertime, like all of these functions, the functionality of our cities and the livability and habitability, thrivability and the beautification of our cities, these are all things that we all benefit from. And we take advantage of it. And that convenience effect is there for all of us. Some benefit more than others. And some, when they take advantage of that convenience, the convenience fee is pretty high. And some people are able to do it and just be like, yeah, it's whatever. Other people is like, man, I can't really afford that convenience. And so then they have to spend their time, their effort, their energy to do it themselves. And the point I'm trying to get at here is that we have created such a system that everything is dependent upon. But we have yet to look at that as the inefficient system that it is. And I have an engineer's mind. Everything is just this big, huge engineering problem that must be solved. And I see inefficiencies in systems everywhere. It drives me a little insane sometimes because I'm just like, inefficiencies in systems, and humans are disgusting. That's usually the two thoughts that go through my head the most when I'm driving around and doing research in understanding cities, in order to model the framework for a city of cities, which is basically just how do we create, the livability, habitability, thrivability, beautification of a city in such a way that we can extend that type of framework, to every city to help level up lives there. Create those common advantages that everybody can have that make sure that it works for everybody. Nobody gets left behind. Nobody gets kept behind. It's not disadvantaging anybody, and everybody gets to live the good life. And what is the good life? Well, the good life is, at the very least, bare necessities of life, right? But then beyond that, it goes to so much more. Like, what else can we do? What else can we make good? Like this thing, it needs a little polish and shine, and then it will be good. It's kind of like the concept of you see a pile of junk, and some people just see it as junk, but other people see it as like, wow, so much potential here to turn it into something amazing. And it's really a matter of like the value that you see, and the value that you can derive from it, and the value you can extract, or the value you can create. And so because we have like all of this, and then we have human ingenuity, the capacity for people to figure things out and make things work, and to take advantage of these systems and make them work for themselves so that they can get along a little bit better and live in the convenience, which gets them closer and closer and closer to living the good life. Whatever that might be for them. But, the problem being that if everything's operating off of money, money does not move so easily in the labor force. It moves very easily in speculation, because it's just like, I have an idea, this is valuable, and I'm going to value at this, and then all of a sudden this thing that probably had no value before all of a sudden has value. It reminds me of one of my favorite books, which was then turned into a movie called The Secret. And it's talking about, abundance and things like that. But one of the stories in that movie in particular, one of the speakers in that was talking about these people who found value in a rock. And he gave a rock to somebody, and the person was like, oh, this rock is like so valuable, can you get I want one of these rocks for myself, my child's sick, I need this rock, whatever. And so this person found this rock and sent it to this person and says, like, here's what you need. And the person saw the value in it, and actually, like, their child ended up getting better. And then they realized the value of just this rock was not in the fact that it was this rock, although it was special because this person took the time and the care to consider what sort of special rock they could send to this individual to help them to use it to help to heal their child. Kind of like a blessing or a prayer invested into this rock. And sent it off to this person, and then the person's like, we created our own hope rocks, and we have sold them and created a bunch of money in abundance, and we gave that to charity. So it was like this concept, this idea of just like, oh, do this thing would be enough for somebody to take something that seems like it's nothing and turn it into something substantial and significant. And on the other end of that, it produced a tremendous amount of good. Like a world's smallest stone, world's biggest ripple. And because it was an extension of this kindness and this care and this concern of this simple thing that then somebody else recognized the value in it and turned it into something else more substantial. I think that's like the good aspects of, speculation, so to speak, is you're seeing value in something that maybe isn't inherent value, but it is an interpreted value, intended value. And from that, you can derive from that, okay, well, if it's an intended value, not necessarily inherent value, how do I convince others that this intended value is something that they can see as well? This sort of thing. And so, I mean, the concept isn't so bad when you think of it in the terms of kind of like, like, oh, a prayer, a prayer is just like simple thought energy going into a specific direction of intending for certain types of outcomes, and then open yourself up to the possibilities and just accepting as it comes in, and then being, blessed by your own sense that, I already have everything. But the idea of trying to convince other people to recognize that inherent value as well. In the terms of speculation, it's more like it's not about the event or the thing or the exchange per se. It's more of the arbitrary schemes of rigging systems to shift valuations in most cases, less about cash and more, in dollars and cents, and more into relationships with a decimal point. And so you convince people of values that really don't tangibly connect to anything, except for this sense of, one day this is going to have a higher value than I say it has today. And then you convince people with this narrative that that's likely to happen. And then people are like, I buy into that scheme. And then other people buy out, get paid out of it, and then it like goes back into like the whole idea of the stock market is just, the gambling concepts behind it and these sorts of things. It just doesn't make sense to me. Like, if your company does a thing and it brings tangibilities of value to people, into society, like, that's what you're worth, not this like, one day maybe we're going to possibly do this thing, and our value, you should just think that we're valuable based off of what we could do, what we should do, what we will do if we can, and then you play with the money and the movements of it and things like that, and make money off of the movement of money, which is why we don't have manufacturing in America anymore, is because people have spent too much investment into the type of economics that's about money moving. It's a nothing thing, like, it's vapor. And so it frustrates me that we see so many people accumulating massive wealth off of these arbitrary schemes that they self-reinforce, and then they use these, arbitrary schemes to suck up cash, and then they go and buy up tangibilities of capital, and price everybody else out of being able to have those. This happens with houses, this happens with, land, this happens with, natural resources, this happens with market shares. In like, smaller businesses are forced to be bought out for pennies on the dollar because of the fact that these larger corporations take up so much of the market share, and they buy up so much of the resources, so they have a lean-in program where it's all in-house done, and they don't have to, rely on other companies and other sources, and so they can, create, efficiencies in their systems and reduce the prices, but then be able to grow that and expand it because they have the resources to do it, and then they just eat out the substance of the little guys in the middleman. And so they end up losing out, and they have to go out of business, and their only hope is to sell to these larger corporations that just gobble it all up. And so, this was the whole reason why we were supposed to have, antitrust and monopolizations and things like that, where these were supposed to be guarded for and protected against. We were not supposed to have that type of thing, because we understood what happens when you have a high concentration of wealth into the hands of a few. The many are not able to have the functionality that keeps, the motor revving in society in terms of the economy, and things will fall apart. And we're seeing that happen now, but it's not as noticeable because, while people feel it and they experience it in their daily lives, you have the government telling you, don't believe what you feel, don't believe what you see, don't believe what, makes sense to you in terms of like your lived experience. We're going to tell you this is what you need to believe. We're telling you is something that completely is hypocritical and contradictory to your experience, because they need you to believe that everything's just fine. and it's not. And so the problem being, more and more people are going more and more destitute, and that means that they end up losing their capacity to retain capital, resource, and agency, and they lose those things, and then they get sucked up by the people who have, rigged themselves into these isolated pockets of thriving, and reinforced through their connections and their networks with other powerful and rich people to make sure that they don't lose any of that. And that they're also not fined when they start preying upon, the forced destitution of everybody else, because the system's rigged out of the favor of people. But going back into the idea, I don't like the idea of fight the oligarchy. I understand the spirit. I totally respect it. I want to tap into that infectious rebellion and direct it towards something that's constructive instead of destructive, because I don't think we're going to get very far in terms of getting everybody to coalesce around a certain ideal of creating a system that holds the oligarchy to account and forces them to, stop being bad actors with nefarious intent, stop, rigging the systems into their favor alone, stop harming everybody else, exploitation, these sorts of things. Because you're not going to get enough people, because so many people have been broken by the system being rigged out of their favor. And they have been, demoralized and dehumanized and disenfranchised and set at a disadvantage, and to the point where they don't have much left to go off of. I mean, they have a breaking point where they'll lash out at, the system because they're so frustrated by it, but there lacks a common cohesive narrative to bring everybody together so that those people can understand what's the American identity that we're working towards, what is the American vision that we're working towards, so that it can be, everybody directed towards a certain specific point of action. And there is nothing that is that compelling. And it's not compelling enough to say, fight the oligarchy. Why do I say that it's not? Because it's not compelling enough for me. I don't want to fight that system. I just want to create a model in which that system is not the antithesis, to everybody living the good life. I want it to be a representation of what is also possible. That will mean that we're going to have some checks and some balances. We have to have anti-corruption mechanisms, and we need to make sure that concentrations of money, power, wealth, and influence are not able to rig systems to disempower, disadvantage, exploit, or force servitude on everybody else. Kind of like the concept of the bailouts of the banks that happened when, we had the economic collapse, and when President Obama came in and he didn't hold the banks to account, was actually one of the, turning points in society that really set everybody up at an extreme disadvantage. We didn't see the, cascading effects of it, the outcome consequences and the, domino effect until much later on. People were enraged and upset at the time, but, news cycles came and gone, people forgot about it, and only those who were hit hardest and most directly and, had to struggle to get out of this, negative position that they were put in because of that, everybody else just kind of like muddled along. And, but nobody saw the reoccurrence of this common theme of the banks were emboldened to think that they had the capacity to just do whatever they wanted, and nobody was going to be able to hold them accountable. They were more powerful than the government itself, They couldn't be held to account. There was no anti-corruption mechanism that could come in to, because we needed them so much. And it's like too big to fail sort of thing. But the problem is like, it's like the inverted pyramid kind of effect. It's like this massive burdening debt, national debt, that has been accumulated for years of subsidies and bailouts and all this other stuff of building up this, upper class and these big corporations. And America's so successful because look at all these companies that are here. This is great. But all of that weight of creating all of that, like including what's happening right now with the massive, disgusting, grotesque amount of money that's invested into AI. Vaporware. It's just vaporware right now. I will get to more of that in a minute. But like the massive amount of reinforcements of holding up this like huge society so successful, America's so great, is all pinned on the individual. And it's the individual that has the least that ends up having to contribute the most to holding up this system, because their share of the abundance that has been created up here is minuscule, and the system's rigged out of their favor, and so they're working for scraps, and they can't get out of that position and do better because their bootstraps have been stolen from them. Some of them don't even got boots, and every ladder rung has been cut off, and walls have been erected to keep people out, of gated communities and things like that. So all of that is down on the individual who has the least, who has to contribute the most in terms of their time, their effort, their energy, their labor, their human ingenuity, just to keep things functionally operational. But again, it's not sustainable, because eventually that person will be so broken that they just fall apart, and you're gonna lose another rung, and all of a sudden the stability of things above are gonna start to show cracks because that firm foundation is just not there anymore. And so, it's in the best interest of everybody for us to establish what I like to call the criterion echelon of society. When I look at this, I don't see things as a hierarchy. I don't see it as like an inverted pyramid in terms of like how to solve for this. That's the system as it is now. Inverted pyramid. All of the pressure and the weight of all of this abundance and success really whittles down to the individual has to contribute more and get less out of it, but they have to hold the weight of the world on their shoulders, and there's no support that's enough to help them to be able to do that. And so if we're not looking at the individual and how we can help the individual to improve their life so they can live the good life, then the rest of all of this is just going to fall apart. So the models that I look at are spherical, and you're looking at it at the core, is humanity, and then it goes out from there in terms of, we have the meager means and we have the modest means, only in the sense of like knowing how close to survival of the human race, the core, the whole point of the exercise, how close are we to not being able to survive? And the closer you are to, the core of that, the more you're barely hanging on. The farther away you get from that, the more of the gravitational force for good can, keep everybody in alignment in such a way where things can have, expansiveness and multiple layers. And so what I look at it in terms of like about, midway is your average, and your average is your standard, and your standard is the criterion. Like, this is what we have to do. And that's where we aim for, both the people at the upper echelon, the outer part of the sphere, and the people in the lower echelon, the lower part of the sphere. Everybody's aiming for that criterion echelon, but they're doing it for different reasons, right? In different ways they approach it. The people in the lower echelon are reaching for it because they want to attain that level, the criterion level. and the people in the upper echelon are, directing towards it, like how can we innovate and invest and develop and build and engineer for outcomes that can help to reinforce that criterion echelon to make sure it's stable and it's sturdy, and it forms the the mantle, the capacity for us to have this structure that is integrity bound, and then working towards how do we get people to achieve that level. And then that brings a solidity in terms of now those who are in the upper echelon of society are not so far away from the people in the criterion echelon. And so we have less to argue about in terms of, the haves have everything and the have-nots have nothing. It's like the difference between the haves and the have-nots is you have more capacity to affect positive change in the outcomes of, humanity and civilization and its development in such a way that those outcomes are good and they work to benefit everybody. It doesn't disadvantage anybody, and it's truly what we would want to achieve together if we all had a say. It's a democratized sense of like, this is what we should be working towards together because it's good outcomes. And so the whole point is to level as many people up to the criterion echelon and then sustain, and then to help more people achieve and expand and to take risks for higher things beyond that, because the more they go beyond that, the more they're going to be able to have the capacity and means to positively reinforce the criterion echelon and to expand it and make it get bigger. And so we work on it together to make it move away from the center as much as possible, because we're giving safe space for everybody to belong, safe space for everybody to participate and contribute and to find different ways to make things work. And that safe space for us to find best practices to achieve what we could possibly call efficiencies in systems, and it's not based off of, how do we achieve, a bottom line, we're in the black, good outcomes for CEOs and large corporations and their stockholders. But our outcomes are geared towards intentionally achieving what we would want to have, which is good outcomes that help reinforce the criterion echelon of society, that make sure America in the world, in fact, works for everybody without the disadvantage of anybody. So nobody gets left behind or kept behind, and everybody lives the good life, And if anybody falls below that, obviously there's some dysfunction in the system and or a dis-ease of the system. And so how do we bring things back in accordance with the sense that everybody belongs in the criterion echelon? And there's a certain point by which people need to first reach the level of being like a prospect in terms of like their capacity to, fit into, belong in, and sustain, self-reliantly sustain within the criterion echelon before they are able to do it on their own. They need to be supported from, the destitution or, meager and modest means to get to the point where they have prospect, which is where they can take risks for higher things because, basic things are secured. This is a, welcoming situation they can thrive on, and then they can expand into the criterion echelon on their own through their own self-development. But society has created the appropriate scaffolding for their lives to be able to level up into that themselves, and it's a system that, instead of rigging it to the favor of a few, it's like literally building that scaffolding so people can build up for themselves tangible wealth, and then convincing the upper echelons, like, we have to have a boundary limit to things that says, if you go beyond this, you are in the excess, and you would be what we would call the deviant echelon of society. You are deviating from the plan, guys. You're deviating from the sensibilities of things need to be retained within a certain level in order for things to operate optimally and efficiently and functionally for the best interests of everybody. We have to consider all planetary stakeholders, and we need to understand what it's going to take in order to make it all work for everybody. And so there has to be like a boundary limit by which, you know, if you go beyond that, you're considered a deviant part of the echelon, a deviant echelon of society. And because that means you are no longer geared towards working together to sustaining the criterion echelon, because the more the criterion echelon goes out, guess what? The more the upper echelons of society expand too, which means you're going to be making more money, you're going to have more opportunities, things are going to be more safe and sound and secure for you, life gets better for you too. You know, it's kind of like a balloon. If you have a balloon and you blow it, you know, the sphere only gets so big, and then you blow it some more and it gets bigger and it gets bigger and it gets bigger. If your boundary and you're at the, you know, upper echelon and that higher boundary, things go bigger. There's more space for you, you know, to try and, you know, take risks for higher things and try new and amazing things. But that core, you know, the center of the core of it's, you know, good humanity and trying to get everybody to live the criterion echelon, which is the good life. That reinforcement ensures that there's not so much of a gap space, you know, chasm between the haves of everything and the have-nots of, you know, living in destitution. There is that reinforcement in the middle. It's that strong core that just gives the form to everything, and it makes sure it doesn't get too out of hand. And so maintaining it is this sense that we're giving structure, we're giving form, and we're creating stability. We're creating constancy and consistency. You're creating something that you can bank on. It's an assurance that you know that you don't have to worry about, you know, people being in too desperate of a situation, or that when, you know, some system over here breaks down, that it's not a total failure across the board and then everybody's SOL. And then, you know, all of a sudden people left to their own devices are gonna, you know, turn on the system because it's broken. Like, there's reinforcements to be able to say, oh, something didn't work here, we got to reinforce and bring, you know, resources to direct towards that over there. It's kind of like an immune system, right? A really great way to kind of like picture this is the concept from the Disney movie Strange World. And great movie, love that movie, brilliant. But the concept is, you know, spoiler alert, they're living within a living creature, a living being, and they don't realize it until they, you know, take risks for higher things. We're like, oh, wow, you know, we're actually wholly dependent on this entire living system. And the living system has its own immune system that goes to direct and protect and to reinforce and to rebuild and manage and maintain and do all these things in order to keep the living being going. And when we look at our economy as this living being, we have to kind of treat it the same way. There has to be, you know, immune responses when things get out of hand. You know, when there's toxification, or, you know, there's corruption, you know, or there's exploitation, these sorts of things. We have to have positive, you know, problem-solving mechanisms, anti-corruption mechanisms, and corrective mechanisms that come in and reinforce and solve for that. Which is very much a concept that I learned from one of my favorite books that I consider about this, which is, well, two favorite books by the same author, Charles Hugh Smith, I'm pretty sure is the name of it. One is Self-Reliance in the 21st Century, and then the other one is Global Crisis National Renewal. Both of those books are brilliant, and they essentially just say you need to be able to have, you know, a functionally operational system. Has corrective mechanisms built into it, and it has to be integrity bound, which integrity means like it has a structure, has a form, has an order, has a purpose, has a place, has a timing, it has a schedule, you know, has an orientation, you know, it has a cohesive constancy, consistency, a narrative, you know, has a vision, it has an ideal, you know, has a form, has an order, has a structure to it. People can consider it and apply it, you know, apply it to themselves, to others, to things, you know, and to live in accordance with it. And in order to achieve that optimization of that model, you have to understand, what's the purpose, what's the proper intended use of the economy, which goes back to the proper capitalism. We have to have a reason why we do the things that we do in economy. And it's, of course, to grow out the criterion echelon of society so we can expand, our horizons, make this a much bigger space for us to do all kinds of wow and amazing things together. But in such a way where it's not rigging the system in favor of a few. It's like we grow together, in these amazing ways. But it's also understanding that that proper intended use has to have a name, a distinguishment. It has to be able to be defined and delineated so people can involve themselves with it. And that's where I believe welfaring stewardship is the solution to that. We are, making sure we're stewarding people, communities, cities, nations, and the planet at large. Humanitas, planetus, communitas, stewardship. And we're making sure that people are faring well, which we have to have a standard by which to be able to say, well, is this well or is this not? Criterion echelon helps us to define and delineate what that means. Where are the parameters of that? And it's kind of a loosely bound system because you want to make things too rigid. But you need to be able to have a sensibility of like when you are and when you aren't in alignment with it, and keep it fluid so that, we can be malleable, adaptable, mobile, and efficient as we move along that, because that's the only way you can sustain any sensibilities with order, because as things change and evolve over time, and all we can do, the best we can do is anticipate, potential outcomes in a scenario universe. We have to be able to, move and shift and change and pivot whenever necessary to keep things going, in a continuum of progress. So our systems need to be built off of the sensibilities of befit the times, but we're trying to orient, how to make sure everybody lives the good life, sustain that criterion echelon, grow it out so we have more, growth and expansion, and make sure that we're all looking at that together. Some of us are looking at it from the, I have surpassed that, and now I must make sure that I reinforce it so that I never have to worry about falling down to that level, because the system will shrink down in size if we don't continuously develop a sense of, expansiveness, of like growing the capacities and capabilities of us, maintaining a form of, stability and domestic order and these sorts of things. And then, everybody's looking to it in terms of like, the criterion echelon is where we all belong, and some will take higher risks for higher things. Some will take just a few risks above that. Some will just live in that with the sensibilities of this is the good life, and we need to create, inspirations for people to want to do that. And I don't think we're going to get that if it's based off of a system of penalizing and pitting against people who have accumulated, in this system that has been rigged into their favor for so long. It frustrates me when I see people who have accumulated money, power, wealth, and influence, and use that to become bad actors with nefarious intent and exploited, weaknesses and violated innocence and these sorts of things, and have gotten away with doing bad things without consequences. And sure, all those things frustrate me. And it frustrates me when I see so many of the people who have accumulated mass amounts of wealth intentionally going out of their way to make sure that other people don't get to have the same types of benefits or opportunities or chances that they benefited from in order to get them to where they are, and so our system we need to make sure that we care enough about, not fighting with each other about the system, but really just mutually agree, come to a consensus on this situation that it really would be to the benefit of everybody if we can establish a criterion echelon and then just maintain that, sense of well-faring, and steward it, because of the fact that that will help other people, even the people in the, upper echelons of society be able to experience so much more. And so much more of the, fantastic futures that they envision would be possible, if you empowered all the people. It, to me, doesn't make sense. I don't see how they, and in most cases when I look at it, it's like they just don't even think about it. Like, how do you orchestrate, beautiful, perfect orchestration of everything coming together as it should and working and having its proper intended use and its place of belonging? How could they possibly think that they can go far if they leave so many people behind? Because it's just not possible. It's not. There is a hard limit to the world if you intentionally make it so it doesn't work for everybody. And many people are doing that because the system as it is designed now kind of demands it, requires it. And I don't think everybody who has been, brought into that echelon and, the little insulated pockets of thriving, I don't think all of them intended to get there and to turn their backs on the rest of humanity. But once you get into it, you're so tunnel vision in it that you forget about where you come from and your humble roots. The fact that, there was a point in time where you didn't have. And to be grateful for everything that got you there, and to be grateful for like the systems that you depended upon. You look at those systems with disdain, like some people that are, millionaires and billionaires now had to rely on social safety nets, and they look at them with disdain, like, ugh, I'll never be that way ever again, and so they shun it, but they forget what a lifeline that was for them, and so they lose connection with that common human touch and forget how important it is. And again, these systems are dysfunctional. They are not efficient, because they don't have a proper intended use. They're more about like keeping people's head above the rising water, without plugging the fucking holes, excuse my language, plugging the holes in the ship, so the whole thing doesn't sink. And there's only so many people that can help keep afloat for the other people, and then waters keep rising, and it's making the situations harder, that a lot of the people that are caring and compassionate are the ones that are closer to being in that position themselves, and they fall in, and then all of a sudden they don't have the capacity to help those people. Now more people need more help from more people, and there's less people to help the people that need the help, and the people in the upper echelons of society are like, they lack the capacity for great care, and they lack vision. They literally are supposed to be these capable problem solvers, but they have failed to solve for just the basic things in society. And I get it, they haven't invested their time, effort, energy looking to those things, because you make money off of luxury, not off of fixing broken systems. There's no money to be made in that. So that comes into, all right, well, let's start making money by making a difference and making the world a better place. Simple as that, right? Which leads me into kind of like the whole inspiration behind why I made this video. I have been thinking of, the economy for a while in terms of, its dysfunction, but then also considering what can be done to fix it. Because once the current administration leaves, we're going to have a really big mess that we're going to have to clean up. And we're going to have a very huge deficit that's going to have to be accounted for. And we're going to have a lot of social safety nets that have been intentionally destabilized by the current administration that was not going to be able to sustain. And they're going to break and they're going to fall apart. Because the integrity that was there, which was based off of, like, we need to have these systems because we can't let people fall that far into destitution, that sensibility and that lack of care and concern has created policies that are trying to make those systems obsolete, with no care or concern about the outcome consequences that are negative to that. And so many people are going to be left by the side of the road, and we need to solve for that. I believe we can start doing things before a new administration comes in and fixes it from that role of POTUS. But in the meantime, there's many things that we can do, especially as a collective society, to improve that situation. And a lot of that is going to take us working together with people who have amassed capital, resource, and agency, and to convince them to help us infuse capital, agency, and resource into a criterion echelon, and then create a welcoming situation that people can thrive on, and then help to establish people to the level of prospect, and then help them to build with self-reliance tools, leveling up of life through the scaffolding that gets them secure in the criterion echelon, and then opens doors of opportunity for, if they want to go and succeed beyond that, they can. With the anticipation that the more people in that upper echelon will be able to help to create a larger criterion echelon and make our experience in America and the world expansive, you know. But in order to do this, we need to think about building something, engineering for the outcomes that we want. And so one of the key aspects of this is education, innovation, and infrastructure, and integral structure, which is kind of like the part that connects the tissue together. What is it? The intersubsidiary system in the body. It's like this fluid that is kind of like an organ in itself that helps to kind of like bind the skin in the body, and helps nutrients go to it, and, you know, keeps the whole thing working. The fleshiness works because of this extra layer system that just keeps things fluid. We need to have something that of an innovative approach to our economics and our state of governance that keeps things fluid, that takes care of the whole state of being, you know, what it is to be human, and takes care of that, and makes sure that it gets everything it needs, where it needs it, when it needs it, how it needs it, you know, at the right time, in the right place, in the right manner, in the right way, in the right amount. And so this is really about an innovative approach to solving for things, you know, problem-solving solutions, corrective mechanisms, anti-corruption mechanisms, and reinforcing, you know, a welcoming situation everybody can thrive on, and building up that scaffolding so people can achieve the criterion echelon of society, the standard of the good life, and then incentivize everybody to work on that together, because what we're trying to do is create an expansive experience that we have more likelihood that, you know, the extraordinary futures that people are trying to envision and build for this, you know, technologically advanced future, we can get there without leaving anybody behind, and that all of the people that are brought along are there because they fulfill a vital role in society. And so this requires what I like to call universal basic innovation. I'm not a fan of universal basic income because it doesn't make sense at all. I don't even like to argue the points of it because I've heard enough of it, and I have already resolved that that's just makes no sense at all. It's a stupid idea. The right idea is universal basic innovation, which is basically to direct our capacities towards creating simple solution innovations that help to create, you know, lifestyle convenience products and services that help people to be able to level up at life, to achieve the good life, to get to that criterion echelon. And if we can direct our sources towards innovating these sorts of things in small ways, we can help people to level up their lives. And when you're producing something, when you're creating something, when you're building a production of something, you have a triangle effect, 3 options. You only get to choose 2, but it's how a thing is made. You can either make a thing directed towards affordability, quality, or speed, which essentially says that the ideal we would want to go for is to have something to be affordable and for it to be of quality. And that usually takes a long time to achieve, because you have to work the systems in such a way, and you have to build intentionally, and you have to build up, the market capacity. You have to build the, entire, chain, links in the chain for the systems of supply and transport and production and, automation and these sorts of things, and training and skills and education for the people, and all of these things have to be taken into consideration. So it takes time to get to the point where you can create such an efficiency to achieve the quality and affordability. But let's take, for instance, the concept of housing. We have a housing dilemma. That entire paradigm needs to be adjusted in terms of shifting away from the commodification, making sure that we don't have, foreign interests buying up our land and then forcing everybody into, that lives here into rental. I believe I'll make another video on that because it's a very long conversation, but essentially to solve out for that problem, we need to reimagine a modern day version of the Homestead Act, which empowers Americans with a legitimate, structured, infrastructurally sound scaffolding for their lives to level up to home ownership, knowing that some people just don't want to own a house, but to the point where they could have the capacity to do so. And then doing so in such a way where we shift the commodification of housing and create an entire segment of our housing infrastructure, that is insulated away from being able to be turned into commodifications. You literally are not getting a house to make money, you are getting a house to make a life and generationally build wealth, which are very different things. But beyond that, we need to build more housing regardless. There's not enough stock, and we need to have more building and maintaining and remodeling our current stock so that it stays up to par and can have more longevity in it built in. And we need to solve for, the things that damage our housing infrastructure, like the effects of climate change. But in the sensibilities of it, just the concept of building up more of that necessary infrastructure of housing, it has to be affordable and it has to be made of quality. These are the 2 things that are going to be able to help make sure that our housing structures, our housing systems, are robust and resilient and abundant, and to the point where everybody has a secure home space from which they can establish themselves and build out from there. It is the point by which you can innovate things into the reinforcement of a safe and sound home space, and help people to level up their lives to reach the criterion echelon of society. There's so many innovations that can be built, small, simple innovations that can enhance a house. We've already seen that experienced from, the development of the toaster oven and the microwave and the blender, and the list goes on. But those sorts of concepts, but the whole idea is to make the house be able to be, sustainable and resilient and robust, and be able to operate, in a highly efficient state and be conducive to well-being, these sorts of things. That's quality. But to achieve that in affordability, we have to create optimizations within the system all along the chains, and to get it up to that par, because we are not there yet. Oh boy, we are not there yet. But we can get there, and there's a lot of work to be done, but it can get there. It's going to take time. But in the meantime, we need to direct our forces towards building that up. And we do that by creating the Homestead Act, which essentially says we are building up the infrastructure to achieve the ultimate goal of the trifecta of, affordability and quality. And we need to, adjust those things over time and work with the time that we have to make it so that people get a little bit of relief and leveling up, and that we can create improvements of efficiencies in the systems and improve the housing stock and quality, but not invest so much in cookie cutter houses, they're all the same or something, and then set ourselves on a trajectory where it's all, like the paperclip problem. We're not all building just the paperclip. Sometimes we're going to need a different thing for different use cases. So we need to give ourselves the capacity to be malleable, adaptable, mobile, efficient, so we can pivot when necessary, so that we make sure that we are optimizing towards achieving those two goals of quality and affordability, and doing it in the fastest time possible, without ecological offense or disadvantage of anybody. And so in order to do that, we have to have a proper intended use of our economics that is created, independent of the existing legacy economics, in an auxiliary system that helps to afford for that to happen, in such a way that is gears it towards people being empowered to be productive in the area of creating these, safe home spaces and developing forests to achieve the outcomes we desire to engineer for the Homesteading Act, to achieve the inevitable outcome of all people having a home, and to have different types of homes that people level up into, to the point where they can have, total home ownership. And for those people that may don't necessarily want to own a home outright wholly by themselves, then they can be in like a cooperative home ownership with many other people. These sorts of things are so many brilliant. Again, I'll make a video about this specifically to lay out the details of what that would look like. But the point is that we need to gear our markets to start building for innovations that can help us to achieve the standard that we're trying to achieve along the lines of the Homestead Act. That's just one parameter. Then we need to do it in, other areas as well, like agriculture and, our education and these sorts of things. So essentially, like, create these acts that are, about, the Homesteading Act to get everybody, housed. The Education Act that is about maker smalls is what I like to call them. I have another video about them, but essentially creating experiential learning that is, modeled off of everybody learns together at all age groups, and you all go to the same place together, and you learn based off of what you need to know and how you can best grow towards bringing out your talents and the best you can be, and learn through experience that then is also creating a productivity at the same time, and helping people level up through life in that capacity, and then opening expansive doors of opportunity to go beyond there into more structured and organized education through university, which will help them to change their models to be away from the weird dysfunctions that are there. I'll have to have a whole other conversation about that. But the idea is setting the stage for universities to help people just grow beyond that to something way more amazing. But up until that point, the point is to make lifelong learners and to get people to want to learn about, the types of knowledge bases and understandings and capacities and skill bases that befit the needs of now. And that, expansively think about where we're going in the future and how we're going to get there and what we need to do in order to get ourselves a capable force, to help to put in the good work to achieve that. And all of this is going to take us, of course, having the grand vision of where we're going. I like to say it as we're on a continuum of an imperishable world peace. We're doing that through, collectively participating, contributing to welfaring stewardship so we can all fare well, to achieve, America works for everyone without the disadvantage of anyone, so nobody gets left behind or kept behind. Everybody lives a good life. Establish a criterion echelon. We're not fighting the system. We're building a new one that works for everybody in such a way that is like enticing and exciting and compelling and then it brings me back into, another thing that I had heard about tonight from one of my most favorite newscasts from MS Now. And they were talking about artificial intelligence, and they had another conversation about artificial intelligence not too long ago that I've considered when I was listening to this as well, in terms of talking about artificial intelligence, like having the energy problem, and then today talking about essentially it boils down to artificial intelligence does not have a proper intended use. And because it doesn't have a proper intended use, you can't create an efficiency for the system to bring down the expansive waste of energy, because you can't optimize energy efficiency until you know what it's for. And then we also have the problem of how do we reinforce, protections for people to help to, make sure that they aren't left behind by this technology, just even, in many ways, but let's just look at it for now in terms of the economic aspects of losing your job to, AI taking over or whatever. How do you create the right types of systems to help people to not suffer from this new industrial revolution if you don't know what you are having to reinforce for? And then how do you optimize for use cases, like the AI balloon that's happening right now, right? Which is funny because I was using that as a model for this, but I guess it's appropriate. You don't want it to get too big so it doesn't pop. You gotta keep it within moderation, right? All things in moderation. But the idea of AI becoming too expansive and getting too big for itself, and then all of these people are pouring all this money and they're saying AI is worth so much money because all of this vast potential that it could do the things. And the comment from the host was hilarious and saying well, at least we'll all have AI girlfriends, which is just a funny, hilarious thing to say. But it's really, that's the best you can come up with. AI is this vast potential of amazingness that just needs to be directed to a proper intended use. And once it is going to do amazing things. But we need to make sure it's not leaving people behind or exploiting people or keeping people behind, just to advance this thing, because what's the point of it if there is no us, We have to be able to retain our humanity. I have always thought of AI, the best aspect of it is an artifice, an artificially constructed intelligence that helps humans to achieve suprahuman capacities. Help us to tap in to our most natural state of amazingness. We have so much potential, and AI should be able to help us to cultivate that and craft it and bring it out so that it can help us to advance and evolve. And, when we're taking risks for higher things, we're doing it far beyond what we can imagine right now. So that's kind of where we need to take AI in terms of proper intended use. I believe if we gear this as a universal basic innovation and try to accomplish with it a sense that we need to have a proper intended use for it to achieve welfaring stewardship and to help us to create the robustness of the criterion echelon, and to optimize for it by helping it to enhance human capabilities, and for it to solve for the things that it can do faster, better, smarter, more accurate, which creates an efficiency in the system that then helps us to be able to achieve the outcomes that we need in a way where we don't have to struggle through, trying to figure things out. It can help us figure it out together, but in such a way where we understand, very much like you remember in school when you're in math class and you're trying to do a division problem and the teacher says, show your work, I always struggle with this in school because math is all in my head. And trying to put it on paper was like translating it from I just know that's the answer into how they needed me to write it on paper was such a laborious, painstaking, senseless, pointless thing in my opinion. But so you have to write out your problem, and the reason why, of course, is that you show your work. So you show that you understand how you got at that problem in such a way that others can understand how you got at that problem, so we can all agree this is how we get at that problem, right? Per se. And so the concept of having that similar idea of you have to be able to show your work means that AI can't just do everything behind the scenes. We can't do it as fast and as perfect as it can in a lot of use cases. But we need to understand what it's doing, how it got to that, because that helps us to grow in our understanding. And that's where I think a lot of AI is failing right now, because again, it's leaving people behind. It's not advancing us. It's advancing the technology, but it's going to go so far beyond us, and it's making all these calculations on its own, behind our backs. We don't see what's going on. And, how do we know that it's not calculating itself back into a point of dissolution? So it's important to understand what it's doing and to understand as much as possible, and to make it part of its purpose is to help us to understand, right? And the idea of what I was getting at before in terms of a universal basic innovation, if we turn AI into a universal basic innovation and we set a parameter on it that helps us to achieve one of the two of the trifecta, affordability, that means that we can get people who are developing AI to gear towards that and optimize for that. And in the process of doing that, you'll discover more use cases for it along the way. So this goes to a concept that I considered when I was taking into consideration Alexander Hamilton, which this is a really great book. Alexander Hamilton helped to consider the idea that the Constitution provided the United States with the legitimate right to establish a bank. Alexander Hamilton was the first Secretary of Treasury for the United States and helped to establish the first bank in America. And it was funded by tariffs and a whiskey tax. And the idea of having this, banking system helped us to take leaps and bounds in terms of our capacities to do things, right? The banking system and the transactional aspects that created, because it created ledger. The ledger was a line, a groove that we can, do a check and balance off of, and that gave us, constancy and substance and something to relate to. It formed one of the bases of a model, and if you're looking at it in like a triangulation, you have, like in calculus, you have coordinations, you have, X and Y axis, and then you have, extensions beyond that, and you can create form and order, and you can create predictabilities, and this is where statistics come in, and, variabilities within the system. Anyway, so the idea of having that gave us a way to substantiate an economy that is based off of not just the transact, from me to you, but the transact between me to you to every other person, that is connected to you in some degree of separation from where I passed, substance of, value from me to you. And so this capacity to imagine out how those inner workings could happen and then actually capture and measure that transaction gave us a sensibilities of how to, establish credit and debt lines, how to create predictions in markets and things like that. It gave us substance and form. And all its simple little line is what it started, a starting point and an ending point. It said, we're creating this mechanization within society for us to be able to create transaction from one to another, and then, once it passes from one node to another node, there's many other nodes that are, touched in there. And from all of that progress, there's productivity, and there's ways to capture that and to generate, wealth and capture wealth and those sorts of things. So, it was, when you look at it, especially with like the whiskey tax, it was like, a lot of people drink whiskey and it transacts a lot. And if we just put a little bit of a tax on that, there's enough that can go into the funds for us to be able to build a basis enough that we could start saying, okay, we have a pooling of common resource that then we can start moving from that one small thing, the whiskey tax, into the pooling and then distribute it massively. And then you have transactions and we got economics. And so it was a good thing. It was a really good thing for society. But why I bring that up is also for the idea of the inspiration of a universal basic innovation that can be valued at $10. That's our limit. That's your affordability. And if we gear systems, artificial intelligence, digital currencies, these sorts of things that are very frictionless oftentimes, because it doesn't have to hardline transact. You don't have to have, I have a thing, I have a mug, and I have to transact it over here. There's no actual substance of carrying that and all the work it takes to do that. It's a very, fluid thing. That fluidity, that flow in there is where a lot of the speculation stuff comes into. But moving that aside for the moment, because I've already talked about it, is the idea that that frictionless system can then be directed towards specific outcomes, and to achieve an optimization that when the creation of the transaction, which essentially represents the energy unit in terms of, like, if we're going to, measure the most basic unit, it's the energy unit. All these transactions eventually unfold, all of the energy condensed in all the work that's necessary to get a thing done, and then that transaction passes over to a person that actually then attains some sort of tangibility on the other end, something of substance, like, the mug that you end up getting. That then is held to account, and then all of the work that went to putting into that then is represented within that individual item, and then that individual item then has whatever value is put into it that is non-monetary. So if the whole point is to optimize as much of this energy efficiency into the system so that the price point of transaction is only $10. So $10 for this mug. But now having this mug, I can translate it into much more value on the other end through functionality, utility, other things like aesthetic appeals and these sorts of things, like that value generation that it creates for me. Then I can take it and build upon it to achieve a higher level of getting myself closer to, the convenience, in closer to achieving the good life. So the idea of the optimization into that type of approach, where in this instance the model for you to wrap your head around was a mug, but think of it as anything. Think of it as a hammer. Hammers are so useful. As a former specialty trim carpenter, and I used to build doors mostly. I love tools, and tools are amazing, and a hammer is very useful. Not universal, but is very useful. And so when you think of everything it takes to combine the resources to create a hammer, and then I purchased a hammer for $10, I have used a hammer so many times in my life to build houses from the ground up. I've built, amazing, beautiful, spectacular doors. For that $10, combined with my human ingenuity and my talent and my skills and my capabilities, my knowledge, my know-how, I was able to use that tool to build so many different things of higher value. I've built doors for $1 million homes, $1 million doors, and so having that simple tool, that innovation, I was able to make myself more money because I invested in that tool that then gave me the capacity to take risks for higher things, right? So that's as simple as what that concept is. In the terms of my teacup, it's nice because I, can fill that up many times over and continue to fill myself up with tea to keep myself going for the day, or just to calm myself, whatever the case may be. But it brings me the value that I need in order to sustain and maintain myself. There's different values for different things, but the whole point is to direct towards the cause for improving the efficiency of systems and creating lifestyle convenience products and services that helped us to optimize our homes for safe home spaces that are conducive to well-being, that help us to level up at life, to be able to achieve the good life, so we can be self-sufficient, self-sustaining, free and independent, self-reliant, self-governed people. Then we are gearing our innovations towards something, and that gives, in this case, talking about AI, an edge by which they can start developing from, and they can start creating efficiencies in their systems in such a way that doesn't stop them from discovering how to make other innovations, but it gives them a through line, an edge, a purpose, And because of that, and creating the efficiencies in the systems, and putting as much efficiency and value and power and capabilities into a $10 innovation, more people can access it because it's affordable. And if you care about what you're developing, because, if you create quality, people will naturally want to, utilize your services or your products. You draw in more customer base, and then you have more to pull from, and then you can start creating efficiencies along those lines. You find the proper intended use when you see, okay, well, there's a vast market in just optimizing safe home spaces for everybody. And then bring back in the concept of the policy initiative of the Homestead Act, where you're reinforcing in a way that isn't geared towards just helping the corporations to be able to make money because it's going to make jobs, and that's great, right? Yeah, sure, but no, if that's all you're optimizing for, you're optimizing for the wrong thing. You need to optimize for the sensibility of what we're trying to achieve together, in terms of outcomes. And the outcome is we want everybody to live the good life. And we know that that can be possible by optimizing safe home spaces for people. And so we create a policy initiative through the Homestead Act to help to give people a pathway to home ownership. And we start building out our infrastructure, innovation, and education, and our systems to, make that possible. And then we establish universal basic innovations that help to infuse into that system, world's smallest stone, largest ripple. A $10 basic innovation is enough to be able to revolutionize the world. And don't tell me it's not, because when Netflix first started out, it was only $9.99 a month to be able to have a Netflix subscription. Good old days when things were affordable. But the idea of, that simple innovation was able to create this vast opportunity for people to experience something that they didn't have before. So it's not like it's impossible. And many things nowadays are membership based, and they relatively keep those membership costs fairly low, but they're constantly optimizing for improving what their offering is because they're competing with so many other, subscription-based streaming services and stuff like that. This is just an example for you to wrap your head around it in terms of like how, can you possibly think that you could create an efficiency in a system geared towards, creating a $10 basic innovation that people can then take up for themselves and create something of substance and value for their lives with. It's like, well, they already do that in the form of streaming services. So, but we need to not just optimize for that. Again, optimize for, creating a safe home space for people. So even if, and this is where, it goes into when I do my video about Homesteading Act, it's going to incorporate this in there as well, in terms of how do we get people to work within this economy and help them to shift away from, legacy employment into this new type of like functional entrepreneurship in like a cooperative kind of way. But one of those innovations could necessarily be an AI literally just pops out brilliant blueprints constantly for different ways to up level your life. And you get this blueprint uploaded into a 3D printer that's at your home, and you can build these innovations in your own home and then component them together to help to build up your house into a more, stable situation you can thrive on, and then take that innovation and expand it out to all your other neighbors, and you're all test subjects for like, well, is this the right type of optimization? Does this help you level up your life better? Figure out if that's the best practices, and then send that signal back, with all that content and data and information back into the system as its positive reinforcement to say, we paid $10 for the innovation. This is what we were able to do with it. And these are the shortcomings and things like that. This is what you should optimize for. Send that relevant information back. The system rebuilds its robustness and then sends it back out into a new form, and then more people build it out. And from there, you have a constant reinforcement of like how to level up at just doing that. And you're doing it in such a way that's accessible, is affordable, but you're building quality. And you know why it's quality? It's because you're getting constant reiterative feedback from the people who are using it, and then you send out those best practices and upgrade those models to new people, who haven't gotten it yet. And so you're creating an efficiency of more value into that $10, innovation. And by doing this, there's a whole this is an entire scheme of economics in itself, but it's based off of tangibilities in manufacturing. It's based off of things people can do for themselves. It's based off of the systems that are working with, an artificial intelligence to reinforce, what our enhancements of capabilities can be on the other end. But this is just one example of the potentials that are there. But I think that if we take it in such a sense where like we give an edge by which innovations can be oriented towards, like we're trying to achieve this thing together and we're going to move along this direction. It gives us a vision of where we're going and kind of like a basic framework, the parameters by which we stay in alignment with, and that thread, that continuum of a through line of like, when we think about what we're doing, it always falls back into, well, we are, going forth and freedom's going with us. We are participating in an economy, which is really about liberty, and that's about having freedom for ourselves and extending it to as many people as possible, and creating a secure situation that everybody can thrive on and make that, situation welcoming for everybody. And, we're optimizing for creating an ever more healthy, sustainable, just, and peaceful world that works for everybody without the disadvantage of anybody, so nobody gets left behind or kept behind, and everybody lives the good life. Because we know when we establish a criterion echelon and we reinforce that, from everybody in society, we grow expansive and we open up more opportunities to take risks for higher things. Like, this is what it takes for us to all get involved in this together. It's not any one person being advantaged or taking from some to give to others. It's not, pitting side against side. It's literally deciding that we have to organize and structure ourselves in society in such a way that we understand that we are all in this together. We are all relevant stakeholders, all relevant planetary stakeholders. We need skin in the game, seat at the table. We need to be able to express our voice and for it to be heard. We need to be involved. We need to actively participate and contribute. We need to be welcomed, and we need to not be, left out of the situation. We need to understand that there's limits to everything, and we need to understand, a sense of epistemic humility. Like, there's only so much but everybody knows something, and together, if we are working towards the same thing, we can all get to know this thing better, to the point where we better understand what it is we're talking about, what it is we're working towards. And once we've oriented ourselves in that way, we can start expecting for better outcomes than what we have achieved before. And so I believe establishing a universal basic innovation framework, creating policy initiatives such as the Maker's Mall for education and the Homestead Act for creating a path to home ownership, and then creating an auxiliary economy that works in tandem with the existing legacy economy to help us to eventually move to the point where our systems are optimized not for profits, but rather for productive outcomes that are good. That get us more, ever more perfect, form of a stable situation, stability, thrivability, and these are things that you can bet on. So, like, when you start building out in this way, if you're building for the next 3 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, next 30 years, and as you do that, new innovations that pop up, and new industries that end up forming, and new inventions that are discovered, and new concepts that are revealed, all of those things now help us to better understand where we are, where we're going, where we've been, and what we're trying to all be about, so that that is informing us of the best chances for success. It gives us an edge by which we can anticipate what is to come, and anticipate the potentials in a scenario universe. So we can kind of be predictive about what's to come, so that we can also be productive. So now you can, invest yourself into something saying, I know come year Mark 3, some really good things are going to happen. And I'm going to be able to take advantage of that. And it's going to be in such a way that, isn't going to disadvantage anybody else. We're all going to level up at that point. In the next 5 years, we're all going to level up at that point. And it just keeps going and going. And so now imagine how companies operate within the economy that has that sort of stability and integrity built into it. It's no longer arbitrary schemes to, capture value and hold on to it as much as you can, and, fighting against everybody, because capitalism as it is not even competitive. It's literally a dog eat dog, mighty crush the weak, free for all hellscape. We need to have an economy that's proper, has a proper intended use, because that does something far better than competition in terms of getting us to optimize and to create efficiencies and improvements. It challenges us. It challenges us to bring out the best that we can. Bring all of our skills, all of our talents, all our knowledge and know-how to bear, and direct it towards certain intended engineered outcomes, so that we can, get at the things that we're trying for, the things that we're striving for. And to do that in such a way where everybody is on the same page, if that's what we're trying to get at right now. And building towards that, then it's not everybody going in separate directions, trying to pull us over here and pull us over here, and we're just like being pulled apart, which is what's happening right now. You know, what a waste of our time, effort, and energy, because, you know, this person gets a little oomph over here and it's like, haha, I'm taking us this direction, you know, and it deflates everything from over here, and then they lose, you know, a few steps behind because there's only so far they could have taken that to begin with. And so now you have like dead arms over here that aren't able to do anything, while this one is kind of immobilized. So now the people that could have been able to come over to help to reinforce that, when, you know, help get through that breakthrough, have been incapacitated. So you're literally self-enforcing a limit and constraining and confining yourself. I equate that to the concept of everybody shooting all these damn satellites, excuse my language, out into, you know, the atmosphere. Like, yeah, surround ourselves and enclose ourselves with a satellite system to the point where we are probably never going to be able to leave the planet, you know? And then space junk's just going to keep falling and puts, you know, health and safety at risk. And, you know, now having anything up in, you know, space is highly dangerous, and China just have an issue of not being able to get, you know, their people back safely without figuring out a problem-solving solution to getting them back, because, you know, some space debris screwed up their, you know, their return vessel. That's kind of what I equate it to in terms of, without having a proper intended use for our economy, we are literally, it's like space junk everywhere. And it's all going millions of miles per hour, and at any moment it could just take anybody out, you know? And it's kind of like the whole AI bubble right now. Like, it's filling up. It's like, oh, this is going to be such a great thing, and everybody invests everything into it, and so all the resources and attention, time, effort, and energy is taken away from other things that need to get done in the economy, because everybody's like, oh, AI is so great. And then when that bubble pops, you know, it's going to be detrimental. And then, by the way, all the other things that were being neglected during that time period still need to get solved. And now all the resources that could have gone to creating the sustainability and stability there have all been wasted on vaporware. It's kind of like equating it to what's happening with the current administration in terms of they're spending vast tons of resources on, you know, this failed immigration plot plan to, you know, basically legalize discrimination and to criminalize human beings for being of a certain color or nation of origin, and all of these terribly, you know, dehumanizing things. They're investing all of this money, spending all of this money to round people up and to build up concentration camps and fly them out of, you know, back to some other nation they've never been to before, and you know, build up this massive police force, and, you know, bribe those people to do these really difficult jobs because nobody wants to be that guy. That's why they wear masks. But you know, everybody knew who the Ku Klux Klan was. It doesn't matter what masks you wear, it doesn't make you any less of a bigot. But it's all the investment of all of this resources into that, and what are we getting in return from it except for dehumanization, fear, like lots of bad things. Whatever little bit of good, like, oh, we're getting rid of the bad hombres, whatever little good that might be, does not justify the waste of resources, because they don't even know how to do it efficiently, because they don't know what they're doing. They're just throwing spaghetti at the wall. You know, what's gonna stick? And in that sense, they're wasting all these resources, when if they just really had a legitimate plan, they could have thought this through and really, you know, optimized and got to work to do the right things and hit the ground running once they were, you know, ready in office. Instead, they were busy doing cover-ups and, you know, trying to recruit people make sure that they pass loyalty tests instead of worrying about whether these people were actually capable of, executing on, things that were going to make sure that you are serving the American public's best interest. So the idea about that in immigration, which, I have a whole another segment that I'll do about that specifically in terms of what I call the gateway city of cities, which creates, a robust, American pride based immigration system. But the better way to have approached that wouldn't be to, invest all this money in punitive, exploitative, dehumanizing, crude, violent schemes. It would be better to invest it into achieving what we would want ultimately the immigration system to look like, and creating that incentive. Build the golden doors, like the Emma Lazarus poem on the Statue of Liberty says, I lift my lamp by this golden door, beside the golden door, and build that golden door of opportunity, and people will naturally go to it because they want legitimacy, they want to be welcomed here, and to do it in such a way where you're creating opportunities for people to come into America and integrate. Is one of the things that I was thinking about today, and I almost made a video about that, which, I'm going to save for later, but I will touch on it now in terms of talking about the H-1B visas and how I believe they are a good thing, but too much of a good thing is a bad thing. I believe that the best way to approach this is to make it part of the prestige of our immigration, to make sure that these people that are coming from other places aren't coming into an environment where, not everybody's going to know whether you have this H-1B visa and you're like some kind of genius or whatever, but you're going to be welcomed into an environment where everybody has been, indoctrinated and conditioned into a situation that says, be skeptical and worry about anybody that doesn't fit the American profile that has, this current administration has, outlined as, well, you're not white enough, so you must be an immigrant, so you're probably not here legally. We're going to swoop you up, and if you don't have your papers on hand or whatever, we're going to, haul you off to jail for an extended period of time till you can prove that you actually belong here, sort of things. Like, who would want to take an H-1B visa to come into that type of environment? Nobody in their right mind. Despite the fact I know they're probably coming from, a far worse situation, and they probably hide themselves off because they don't want to go into, an environment where, their neighbors are looking at them suspiciously as whether or not ICE is going to come around the corner and swoop them up. That's not prestigious.